Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for this afternoon's program, The Voyages of Memory, a conversation with Marjorie Agosin and Ruth Behar. Before we get started, the usual note to remind you that your video and audio will be off throughout the program. We welcome questions. You can send them along in the question panel at the bottom right. We ask that you keep questions short and please refrain from comments so that we can try to get to everyone's questions today. I'm delighted to introduce both Ruth and Marjorie, always great guests here at the Yiddish Book Center. Marjorie Agosin was raised in Chile, the daughter of Jewish parents. Heeding rumors of the coup that would install Augusto Pinochet, her family left the country for the United States, where she earned a BA from the University of Georgia and an MA and PhD from Indiana University. In both her scholarship and her creative work, she focuses on social justice, feminism, and remembrance. Marjorie is the author of numerous works of poetry, fiction, and literary criticism, and has received numerous awards and honors for her writing and work as a human rights activist, including a Jeanette Rankin Award for Human Rights and a United Nations Leadership Award for Human Rights. The Chilean government honored her with a Gabriela Mistral Medal for Lifetime Achievement, and Marjorie is the Andrew Mellon Professor of Humanities at Wellesley College. Ruth Behar is an anthropologist and creative writer who is acclaimed for the compassion she brings to her quest to understand the depth of the human experience. She was born in Havana and has dedicated her scholarship to the Spanish-speaking world, carrying out research in Spain, Mexico, and Cuba that has yielded pioneering writing across disciplines and genres. She's the award-winning author of numerous books and the first Latina to be named a MacArthur Genius. Ruth has also received a Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, a Distinguished Alumna Award from Wesleyan University, and the Carnegie Corporation's Great Immigrant Award. She is the James W. Fernandez Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Welcome to you both, Marjorie and Ruth, and please forgive me for shortening your bios. You're both two incredibly accomplished women, and we are delighted to have you here. So hop on and we can get on with your conversation, which I know I'm looking forward to, and I know our audience is. So Marjorie, we just need you to come back on the screen now.
Okay.
Excellent. And I turn this all over to you for conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa, for that incredibly beautiful introduction. We are both so honored to be here today with the Yiddish Book Center. I love the Yiddish Book Center and admire the work you do so much. So thank you so much for this incredible honor. And of course, it's a huge honor to be here with my friend Marjorie Agosin, who's a friend and mentor and someone I admire so much and a leader in the whole field of Latin American Jewish writing. So Marjorie, so great to be here with you. And I want to just say that her book, A Cross and a Star, this is the original edition from 1995, and now there's a new edition from 2022. And I love this book. It's a book about her mother's story. And I wrote the foreword to the new edition, something I'm very, very honored and proud of as well. So Marjorie, if you think it's okay, I'm going to read from my new book, and maybe we can start that way to talk about the Voyages of Memory. We've both been very concerned with memory, with Jewish diasporas, and with writing and writing in different genres, poetry, fiction, memoir, essay, among all the different genres in which we write. And my newest book is Across So Many Seas, and it's also now in Spanish, A Través de los Mares, and it just came out. And while I haven't yet written a book like this, I gave myself the challenge of trying to see if I could write a novel in four different voices from the point of view of four different girls, each of them 12 years old and living in a different place and in a different time period, The first girl, Benvenida, is living in Spain, in Toledo, Spain, in 1492, as the expulsion of the Jews is happening. That's her story. Then we move to 1923 and the story of Reina, a descendant of Benvenida living in Turkey. And she's going to end up having to go to Cuba. The next girl, Allegra, is living in Cuba in 1961 at the time of the Cuban Revolution. And then the last girl, Paloma, is living in Miami in 2003. And all of their stories end up connecting by the end of the book. So we're each going to read a passage or a little section from our books. And I'm going to begin from part 3 with Allegra, who is the girl who is living in Cuba at the time of the revolution. And she doesn't know a lot about her mother, Reina, who is the girl who has left Turkey in 1923, but she's going to start finding out some things when her mother receives a letter. I know. Mama lets out a wail that I can hear as I am huffing and puffing up the tall staircase to our apartment after returning home from school. She often cries silently, letting the tears slide down her face, not bothering to dry them as she stirs a pot of lentil soup or kneads the dough for potato and cheese borrecas. I have tasted Mama's tears in the food I eat. But this wail is like a clap of thunder. A dark cloud inside Mama seems to have burst. Mama, what happened? Tell me. Why did you scream like that? You scared me. She's holding a letter in her hand, one of the letters she receives every now and then from her sisters in Turkey, and now she is mumbling, My Mima, dear Mima, why couldn't you have waited a little longer so I could see you again? And that's how I learned that her mother, Mima, the grandmother I will never know, has died. I'm sorry, Mama. I hug her, feeling her wet cheeks. Tell me what it says in the letter. I know so little about my mother's past. Every time a letter arrives from her sisters, Susie and Dina, she reads it over and over, cherishing every word. But when I ask about her life in Turkey and why only she came to Cuba, all she'll say is that she was sent here when she was 12 to be her aunt's companion. Come, let's sit on the balcony. It's time I tell you more, she says. It's late in the afternoon and the sun is fading. We hear the mournful horn of the lanchita, the ferry that goes back and forth from Havana to Regla, as it sets off yet again across the harbor. Mama turns to me and says, When I left Silivri, I always thought I'd get to go back to my family one day. And even though your papa and I only make enough money to live day to day, I never lost hope. But now she's gone. Why didn't your family come with you to Cuba? Tell me, Mama. Did you come all by yourself? I traveled here with Tia Simbul to this very apartment. Then after I married your papa, she stayed with us till she died, right before you children were born. You've never told me how you met papa. How did you decide to marry him? I didn't decide. My father decided. What? I don't understand. It was an arranged marriage. I had no say in it. I didn't meet your father until I arrived in Cuba. Mama, you didn't marry Papa when you were only 12. That's my age. No, Ijika, he agreed to wait until I was 15. Oh, Mama, that's so young, and I can't believe you didn't get to decide for yourself if you wanted to marry. Things were different when I was young. Arranged marriages weren't such an unusual thing back then. She looks down at the letter in her hand, runs a finger across the Turkish stamps. Then she continues, What was sad was that my father stopped talking to me before I left Turkey and hasn't written a word to me since. Your papa tried to smooth things out with him. He wrote and told him what a good wife I was, but it was useless. He refuses to forgive me. He's still alive in Silivri, would you believe it? He is 20 years older than dear Mima. How is it possible that she died first? Mama, what did you do to make your father so angry? It was all because of a song, Allegra. If I hadn't wanted to sing it so much one night long ago, perhaps I'd still be in Turkey. So I'm going to pass it on to Marjorie. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, and it's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And again, I want to thank Lisa, Elizabeth, Aaron, and the entire team of the Yiddish Book Center for allowing us to be in conversation and to share our work, because I think that the Yiddish Book Center is truly not only remarkable, but it's a voyage in memory and the preservation of memory through books and literature. So I believe that what many things unite Ruth and I, especially our very, very long friendship, but also we are very interested in writing about our families, our mothers, our fathers, or young adults, like you have just read in your new book. So almost 30 years ago, seems a very long time, I wrote a book called A Cross and a Star about my mother's life growing up in the south of Chile, which it was populated by German settlers that arrived in the 19th century, and also by Nazi sympathizers and even SS men. And I just was curious to know what was it like for my mother to have parents who were born elsewhere and to live in such a community that it was in a way quite frightening to always be an outsider. But I think after so many years that this book was in print, and now it came out again with a beautiful afterword from Ruth and published by the University of New Mexico Press, I think I wanted to, the thread of this book and many of the threads in Ruth's books speak about what is memory. Is it a voyage? Is it a moment? Is it something intermittent? Is it a mystery? Is it what you wish to remember and what you wish to forget? So I believe our work explores this incredible theme that defines humanity. When I published this book, and I use a lot of tapes and notes that my mother shared with me, many of her friends and family members didn't like this book, perhaps because it's a very literary book and they are not used to reading literature. But they said that this book had no beginning, no middle, and no end. That was loose, that was fluid. But that is exactly what I wanted to do, because this is the nature of memory. And what happened, because one thing is your writing, and we were talking about this with Ruth, but then something else happens when you are writing, something unpredictable, uncertain. So I was writing with the voice of my mother, but then the voice of my mother became my voice. So this is a book about a mediated memory. And I think that after 30 years is quite timely, because it also touches upon the idea of what is to be a foreigner. Who is a foreigner? And who occupies this title of distinction, or a title of being cursed? So this has been translated by Celeste Costopoulos Cooperman from the Spanish. And when I published this book in Chile, people did not like it because they saw that I spoke about the SS men and the Nazis, and they said I should have remained silent. But nothing is more boring than silence, especially when you have to talk about social justice. So I'll read a brief paragraph that almost encapsulates the flow of this memoir. Memories. Passing memory, imagined and intermittent. Memory, like a chest of magical echoes, like a compass in a familiar closet. I gaze at my memory and shake her long locks of hair, not knowing if I tell what I invent, or I invent what I tell. I wish to talk about a mythical and myth-making country on the southernmost tip of the planet. It is called Chile, a fertile and generous land. It is a country of deluded wanderers and poets. My father arrived here I'm speaking as my mother. My father arrived here escaping from a Viennese cabaret dancer, and his brother arrived escaping from the gas chambers. I was raised in a very small town named Osorno. When I learned about the tepid rocks of the dawn and about the coriander, and where I also learned that Jewish girls could not go to the German, English, or Catholic school. Attendance, however, was allowed at the less prosperous Indian school, where they learned how to love me and where I didn't feel like an outsider. In Osorno, Chile, the Nazis were the great feudal lords of the South, and being Jewish was like possessing a savage and dangerous car. I write these sometimes intermittent and true memories with the voice of an adolescent and then of a woman. I approach them, my memories, pulling out from my body a Star of David and the Yiddish language secretly spoken in the silence of castrated faces. In a cross and a star, I wish to talk about my life in a noisy house in southern Chile and about a town with 50 Nazi sympathizers, 5 Jewish families. Everything I tell you is true. And this is why I write, so that it will be even more certain. So this is a bit of the beginning of the book, and it's written in vignettes, prose poems, because I think memory is like a vignette. It just comes and goes, and it's a fragrance, it's a word, it's a voice.
That was beautiful, Marjorie. Thank you. I loved the reading, and I loved what you said about memory and about being a foreigner. Those are all things that I can definitely identify with so much. And as you know, on my mother's side, I'm Ashkenazi. On my father's side, I'm Sephardic. So I have from both traditions, and the Yiddish from my mother's side of the family as well. So with regard to memory, you've been honoring your mother in Across in a Star, and in the two recent novels I've written, Letters from Cuba and now Across So Many Seas, I'm honoring each of my grandmothers, first the maternal grandmother, the Yiddish speaking grandmother, and now the Sephardic grandmother, the Ladino speaking grandmother. But both grandmothers ended up in Cuba with very different stories, but both passing through this similar diaspora and then eventually coming to the United States. So we have all of these, you and I have these crisscrossing diasporas, which means that we have taken on the role of memory keepers, because so much has happened to our families over the generations, right? And we want to hold on to these memories and as you said, make them more true by writing about them, even if at times that actually involves writing fiction and not telling the exact story as it happened.
When did you feel, Ruth, that you wanted to begin with these voyages of memory? I noticed that you began when you started to write young adult novels, right? That was
Well,
um,
even before that, in my career as an anthropologist, I was already very interested in the Jews of Cuba, and I wrote a book many years ago called An Island Called Home, and it's about the Jews of Cuba, but also connecting with the Jewish Cubans who left Cuba and came to the United States. So I was already very interested in memory then. And even in my work as an anthropologist, when I wasn't working on the story of my own family in Spain, I worked in a little village in northern Spain, and my book was called The Presence of the Past. in a Spanish village. So even then in my 20s, before I began to work on the family stories, I was already very, very interested in the past. And like you said, like what is remembered, what is lost, how are decisions made about what is passed on. And in Spain, I found documents for this little village in northern Spain that went back to the medieval period. So I was very interested in kind of what gets passed on. So I was thinking about that, but I wasn't thinking about it in terms of my own family until much later, like you said, until I really started writing the fiction.
And do you, and maybe perhaps then the audience will engage in this question, but during this last year, somehow we feel that we have lost the world as we knew it, and the sense of the world. So do you think that in your writings, and especially the young across so many seas, letters to Cuba, you are reclaiming that lost world, or maybe you're creating a new world?
I love that question. I think maybe both. I think I'm holding on to worlds that I know have ended to some extent, but they still have reverberations. They still echo in our lives today, even if those lives are now quite over, those worlds are quite over. I think they still have echoes in the present, and that's what I'm interested in. And I think you're right. I mean, this is all writing that I've done before October 7th, but I'm sure that from now on, our writing is going to definitely be deeply affected by everything that's been happening in the past 6 months. But I think both of us have written in different ways about anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred in the world in different places. I think we've both been concerned about that topic now for many years.
And what I really like your picture book about the Dia Fortuna, Miami. Would you talk a little bit, because I think it's so important to tell young adults and even younger than young adults stories.
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I have the book right behind me, in fact. Tia Fortuna's New Home is here, and this was for me such an important book to write. This was kind of the beginning for me of telling a Sephardic story for young people, Tia Fortuna's New Home. So I started with this picture book, and even though it's under 1,000 words, it was so challenging to write. It was like writing a really difficult poem. And we both have published books with Swan Isle Press. We've both published some poetry books with that wonderful publisher, and you of course have published many more poetry books. But for this, writing this book for me was like writing a prose poem, trying to tell a story in a very concise way, but that would really open up the reader to the Sephardic world through the story of Tia Fortuna, who's based on my aunt, but also is very much a fictional character. And I wanted very small children to understand, like a 5-year-old child to understand what a Sephardic identity might be and what it might mean to come from many diasporas. So I wrote this book, and it was just such a beautiful experience. But then after I was done with it, I thought I really have more to say for older kids and older readers and adult readers too. And that's how Across So Many Seas then came out of this book after writing this book. Yeah.
One thing I like to say, and then I'm looking at the time so that
Hmm.
we could have our audience, and I thank very much for all of you from across the world that are here. But Ruth spoke in my class Friday, and she said something very special and beautiful, that when the Sephardic community, the Latino speaking communities, um, were expelled from Spain and they chose not to convert to Christianity, they always left with a song. And I kept on thinking that that's, amidst so much tragedy, there is this hope that you're being expelled, but you're singing and carrying your language with you. And I thought that what is similar in both of our works is that maybe memory is like a song. It could
Mm.
be an unheard song or a heard song, but there's always a voice in memory, and even if it's a voice without words. So I'd like to just end this, if I think I'm looking at the time. In this conversation was the idea that what is lost can become a song. What is lost can become a memory that was not quite understood, or even a new memory. But what for me, and we talk about it a lot with Ruth, you must write it, because writing is really recovering from loss, even if it's a verse, a poem, a word. So we talk a lot about, I think what Walter Benjamin talked a lot about the idea of against forgetting. But I'm really thinking now that we have to write against losing ourselves, and we have to create almost like a banquet of memories, whether they are sorrowful or whether they are joyful. So the idea of a people exiting the country that they live for hundreds and hundreds of years is very symbolic of a new future. And I think the Jewish people have tried to create a new future in whatever lands they were received, because it was incredibly difficult to get visas for Chile, I'm sure, for Cuba, for Brazil, for Mexico, and even more sad, it was very difficult to obtain visas from the United States. Tim Burns, a wonderful documentary about becoming a Jewish refugee in America. So I thank you, Ruth, for your work, and I think we should just open the chat for questions, right, Lisa? Yeah.
Yeah, that was, let me just say, I thought that was incredible, everything you said, Marjorie. Thank you. And that we represent, the two of us being Jewish Latinas or Jewish Latin American women writers. We represent this connection to the other America because our families weren't allowed into this America back in the era when they were trying to leave Europe. And so we represent also that loss, but also that possibility that our families got to know a whole other America by becoming part of the Spanish speaking world. And I think that is such an interesting part of our history, and also our unique perspective as well, now living in the United States as Latinas, as Jewish Latinas.
Um, it's always wonderful to listen to both of you in conversation. There's no doubt about that. And sort of the two last comments that you both made segue really nicely into a couple of questions. I'll start with just picking up on what you just said, Ruth. Somebody is curious to know how the two of you met, because your work now becomes so woven together. How did you find your way to one another?
Do you remember, Ruth?
I'm trying to remember the very first meeting. I think we may have been at a conference, but I know that you interviewed me for a book as well, and also asked me to participate in House of Memory. But I think we must have met even before that.
Yeah, I think we met at a conference. Don't remember the conference, but I remember where it was. Saratoga Springs, New York. Skidmore College. We met that, maybe that was 35, 34 years ago. Um, uh, and it's interesting, before you did your work as an anthropologist, as a poet, and then we met through we began sharing our creative lives through poetry and through these last recent books of memoirs, and also I've read your novels about Caro,
Hmm.
Caretaker of Your Mother and You. So we have been engaged in really a very important literary conversations. And as a friend of mine, a Spanish writer and journalist, Rosa Montero, she always says that what really matters is to be relevant. And I think we have been relevant to each other's work and to the world at large.
Yeah, definitely. And I've looked up to you because, I started out as an anthropologist. I'm still an anthropologist, but I so much wanted to be an artist and to write poetry and fiction and novels, but I wasn't sure that I could do it. And I looked to you for your mentorship and your encouragement and your support. So you've played such an important role in my life. And when I met you, I already knew about your work, and I was so honored to be able to meet you. So I've always looked up to you so much. So you've been a friend, but also just such an important inspiration as well.
So, one participant is saying you both teach. Is your memory writing a way to share history for future generations? Do you think it relates to that work?
Well, lately I change my mind all the time, which is good because I'm not fixed in certain ideas. And Ruth and I were speaking Thursday. You said, "Do you want to be read?" And I hesitated because at this stage of my life, of course, I want to be read, but I want to be read by very special readers, very loving readers. I don't want to be read by a multitude of people that perhaps will not find this work interesting or relevant. But I like to say that I just write because of this enormous need that I have to put in words sentiments, ideas, concepts. I don't write to influence people. I hope I could influence them, but I write to preserve stories, concepts, and the Chilean poet Gabriela Mistral said, "Those that love me will find me." In a time without emails, websites, or all these new advances in technology, they are no longer advances because now we are in AI. But I know that there's going to be someone, a young person, an adult, that will find me. And one day I was coming through JFK, and a custom official stopped me and said, "Did you write this? Did you write that? Are you Marjorie Agosin?" I thought he was going to arrest me. I said, I think you're talking about Isabel Allende." He says, "No, I have read all your books." So it's like a customer, a passport official reading The Cross and the Star and Always from Somewhere Else. He found me. But I don't write to change the world. Maybe I write to change myself.
Mhm. Oh, that is so interesting. Wow. What a smart customs official you you got to
I was
meet.
scared. Yeah.
That's wonderful. I think I write for similar reasons. I think, it's wonderful that we're talking about memory and remembering, because I think I do write very much to remember, particularly to remember the stories of those that came before me, the ancestors, the grandmothers, the grandfathers, my parents, and others that I didn't know. In writing across so many seas, I went all the way back to 1492 to those I didn't know, but imagining who would have been my ancestors, 500 years ago, just trying to imagine that, and trying to imagine, are there still any echoes today, being Sephardic, at least on one side of my family, are there any echoes of 1492 even today? Just trying to imagine, like, how far back does our history go and our remembering. So I wanted to try to bring that, into my writing. But I think both of us, Marjorie, have started writing for young people. I think we both write novels that could be read by a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, but also can be read by an adult as well. I think we're doing writing that's very all ages. I like to think that it's for all ages, and I think we are writing for this generation, but also for future generations. And we don't know who our readers are going to be, but I think readers find the books they need. I think books can sometimes almost be like medicine, and you have to find the book you need to heal whatever is broken inside you, whatever needs to be understood inside you. So I think readers find us, and I know I feel that way about the books, that I read. I go, oh my God, I really needed to read this book, but I didn't know until I read it. So I think reading has this beautifully mysterious kind of thing to it, and it's a very spiritual relationship that you form, that the reader and the writer form with one another. So So I think that's all, very, very important, the work that we're doing now and bringing this whole culture that we know about, this Latin American Jewish culture, bringing it into children's literature because it hasn't existed before. There hasn't been a children's literature that really speaks of this whole experience of Jews living in the other America. So we're actually filling a gap, in the literature right now so that young people can know about these stories. They don't have to wait to be 20 years old and reading them, when they're at Wellesley College or University of Michigan. They can start reading when they're 10 about some of these stories. And I'm excited too because I'm now a grandmother, I'm an abuelita, and now I have a granddaughter who's 3 years old and another one who's 1 year old. And the thought that they might read these books one day is very exciting to me.
Um, these stories you talk about were told to you by members of your family. Do you tell stories related to your Jewish immigrant life other than the ones you put in books that people in your families can take and convert into new, renewed ways to use memories of others?
Marjorie?
It's a memory of others within the family or just generally?
I think they're asking generally.
Okay, this is a very complex question. I believe families don't read, at least in my family, they don't read these memoirs. My parents read it because I wrote about my father and mother. Some family members read it to find themselves in it, and they did not like what I wrote about them. But they found themselves in it, even though they had no name. But I wrote these two books as a tribute to my parents, as a love of my parents, who they still are because I feel they're alive, and their nobility, their dignity. So that was a gift for them. But some members of my family said, "Oh, but you wrote about your grandmother and said she was a soprano and she didn't even know how to sing," or uh, so people don't perceive the works of literature as the writers perceive it. So I hope other generations, I hope that my students that may read Across a Star or Ruth books may be encouraged to write about their own families. But one does not write for the family. One writes, perhaps one writes for the universe, for a flower, for an unknown. But I never wrote these books for my family. Quite the contrary, I only wrote it to honor my parents.
Mhm. Well, I know that my mother and father are with us today. They're listening to the conversation. So, hi, mommy, papi. I know you're here listening. And I think what we write, it's sometimes not the exact story of the family, but it has the emotion of what was felt. That's how I feel when I'm writing, that I'm not always telling the exact truth of the story as I know it, but the emotional part is real and it's true. And with Across So Many Seas, there was just a lot I didn't know. So even this little piece that I read today, it's based on a true story. My aunt, my father's younger sister, remembered her mother, my grandmother, receiving a letter that made her cry, and it was a letter letting her know that her mother had died in Turkey. And she shared that story with me, and I was so moved by the emotion in that story, and just, her being a younger girl watching her mother receive this very sad letter, and there was nothing she could do. She couldn't go to Turkey, and the sadness of all of that. So I had that story, but I changed a lot of, I kept that story, but I changed other things. So I feel that a little bit like the way Marjorie wrote Across on a Star in fragments. I feel that I use fragments that are true of memory, but then they get mixed in with how I imagine things or the story that I want to tell based on what I know. So there's always this mix of fiction and nonfiction. It's not totally true. But I think in that sense, it makes it easier for my family to read the fiction than say memoir, because in fiction, I can mix together what I imagine and what happened. And no one has to know which is which except for me, right? And possibly some of the family members. So I feel like it creates a little protective armor, I feel, so that you can, I think, approach the emotion of the stories and not have to face the exact story as it happened. So that's one of the freedoms that I feel I have gained writing fiction now, as opposed to writing anthropology, where with anthropology, I have to be very exact and accurate and write about what I actually experienced and what people actually told me and the stories I recorded and transcribed. It's a very, very different process, and fiction does allow you to kind of fly into these other realms, of the imagination, which I think is very exciting to be able to do. But it's something that I didn't do until just 10 years ago when I started seriously trying to write fiction. So it's exciting to have known both possibilities of how to write.
It's interesting to think about memoir and the work that you're doing and how it doesn't fit the typical genre of memoir, and yet it draws from memory in ways. So the complexity of what you're doing, both of you as writers, is really kind of fascinating, and that you're both working in that same, I don't know, stratosphere. Let's go on to another question. When researching about memory and literature, what are your go-to authors or critics?
Let's see. I like to read. Well, first of all, researching is one thing, and then the creative space is completely different. But I like to read Pierre Nora. I like to read Benjamin. I like to I like to read Marian Hirsch about post-memory. There are many, many. I like to read Borges, who wrote a very fascinating short story about a man called, his name is called Funes el Memorioso. I think Funes the Memorialist. The problem he has that he cannot forget. I like to read a lot of Israeli writers because I think, for example, one Aleph Bet Yoshua, because they speak about the diasporic memories of their parents, their own, and they're present in Israel, and they have lived the diaspora to their parents and also try to become independent from their parents. But I am interested in this, and also, especially Paul Celan, Kafka, Shakespeare. But then I think I forget all what I read. It's somewhere in the mind, but when you write a memoir, you have to let yourself be inside memory itself. And you cannot, and I'm speaking maybe from the craft of a writer, you cannot allow to have detours, because you have to be so immersed in what you're trying to say. You can have many drafts. You cannot let the drafts of the wind or of open windows get inside you. You have to just be totally alone, totally immersed in what you're trying to remember, and be surprised at what it emerges. But also, for some people, this is very, very hard because you have to trust your own writing, your own longings, your own nostalgia. I believe research is important, scholarship is important, But when you write about intimacy, no book will be important as what you are writing. And memory is a form of intimacy.
Wow. Marjorie, I could listen to you all day.
Ditto.
My family doesn't want to listen to me, so I'm lucky.
I'm happy to anytime. This is so interesting and inspiring, and I just wish I could have written down all the various authors that you mentioned. But a lot of them I also feel very inspired by as well. Many of the ones that you mentioned are authors that I know, but not all. And definitely, I mean, I read widely in many fields, in fiction, in history, in anthropology, poetry, like I love Mary Oliver's poetry, for example. So I try to read widely, and it's all very inspiring. And then now that I'm writing for this age group, this middle grade age group, I'm also reading a lot in that category as well. I was very inspired by Alan Gratz's book Refugee, which is three different characters who also end up converging, and it's such a beautiful book, and I found that inspiring. There's a book called Letters from Rivka by Karen Hess, and that's a beautiful book about a Russian Jewish girl on her way to Ellis Island and writing letters to her cousin who has stayed behind in Russia. That book was very, very inspiring to me as well. I read a lot of Sephardic literature, all different kinds of books about the Sephardic world, history books in particular. I read a lot of chronicles of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. It's great that I love that historians collect documentary material that we can then use for fiction. And there's a book that's The Expulsion Chronicles, it's called. And I drew on that a lot to understand that period. Also, when I was writing previously Letters from Cuba, there's a book that's a collection of letters by Jewish immigrants making their way to the United States, and these like original letters were collected in these volumes. And I found that so interesting to be able to just hear the voices of just regular people who were immigrants. So I like to find in what I read, examples of just ordinary people and what they thought and how they wrote and what they were experiencing. That I find that very, very, very inspiring. And then I just read across memoir and fiction. I liked Danny Shapiro's memoir Inheritance, found that to be so interesting. And been thinking a lot about this whole question of inheritance and genealogy. There's a book also called Homegoing by Yagasi, which is a really beautiful book. She's an author from Ghana, a Ghanaian American author, and Homegoing is several generations of people, and she tells the stories from the voices of the different generations. I love books like that. I find them really, really, really interesting. And Marjorie, I love reading your work. Your book also, you have a beautiful Sephardic book called White Islands, Las Islas Blancas, which I love, which is a beautiful, evocative book about Sephardic identity. I come back to that book many, many times in my reading.
Thank you. And I just remembered a book that I returned to. I forgot the guy's first name, but it's called Yerushalmi, which is like one of the most important books on the meaning of Jewish memory. And it's very interesting because he thinks that there is a duty to remember. And it's a duty to not to remain silent. And a very important and very fascinating contemporary writer is Andre Aciman, who really writes about his Jewish past as an Egyptian in Alexandria. Now also, I very much like David Grossman's books. I think one is called The Grammarian, which is really the story of his parents, the Holocaust, and the present. But also the books you've mentioned, they're really quite beautiful and quite important.
Let me add to that also, he was a big inspiration in my life and unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Victor Pereira, also The Cross and the Pear Tree, and many other books that he wrote. He was so significant and really one of the early Latin American Jewish writers who wrote from a Sephardic perspective. Really beautiful, beautiful author. Just, I always remember him. In fact, I have his books right behind me. That's why I had to turn and look at them for a moment.
We may make this our last question. And it's could be kind of expansive. Who knows? You both seem to write from the sense of place that figures into your work. And does or doesn't visual come into play for you?
What do you mean, the visual
I think
experience?
I'm saying the visual, either visual memory, visual experience, visual maybe as a prompt. Is there a visual aspect to this, to the work that you do and to how memory prompts the work?
I'll answer this briefly, but I think each work of art finds what the work of art needs. But for me, as a poet, what comes first is the sound. And my family said they don't understand that I sit in the dark for 3 hours, but I'm listening. I'm listening to the sounds of the world, to the rain, to the wind, to a leaf from a rubber tree falling. So for me, it's sound. And then comes, if I'm writing, let's say, about the sea, of course, the image of the sea, but more than the image of the sea and the waves and the water, is the sound, is the sea silence, the sea's roars. And I think also I'm feeling this more and more. I like the word because this is how I feel about the word right now. Penumbra. You can translate it in many languages. More than the visual is this very complex dialogue between darkness and light. And that's where all my creative work kind of begins. But again, if I were a painter, of course, the visual would be fundamentally important, but I'm beginning to know and to think that painters are more interested before they paint or get ready to paint. They're interested in poets much more than painters. So they must also find the voice. And this is how I feel about my own sense of writing.
Yeah, I totally understand that. And I think voice and sound is so important. But I think with me, the visual is significant. I studied photography when I was in graduate school, and I was very seriously interested in photography. And I learned how to use those large format cameras where you had a 4x5 negative and you had to get under a black cloth to take the picture. And I would take, with my husband's help, I would carry these cameras to Spain and to Mexico and take pictures, and I have a vast collection of thousands of pictures that I want to do something with one day from Spain, Mexico, and Cuba. So the visual has been important to me. I've loved photography always and loved film, and I did make a documentary film many years ago about the Sephardic Jews of Cuba, and for me, getting the visual sense of Cuba was very important. It was one of the reasons why I had to go back to Cuba. I had to see it with my own eyes. It wasn't enough to just hear the stories. I had to actually experience and actually be in the places where my family had been and stand in the actual places where they had stood, and even places where I had stood, like pictures of me standing in front of one of the major synagogues in Havana. I had to go and stand in that place myself and see it with my own eyes. So I think for me, maybe that's the anthropologist part where I had to actually witness and be in the places myself and see the places. So I think the visual has been important to me. And I think in the fiction that I'm writing now, I think the visual descriptions are important. Like you said, I think Marjorie, we share, a love for the sea, for the ocean, and because our families did cross many seas to get to where they got, I think the sea, the ocean is always very important. And I like to be near the ocean. I feel something very special. It's hard to describe, but I just feel like the ocean, seeing it and being in that space of being between places that the ocean gives you, to me is very important. And I think that that inspires me. And the visual inspires me too when I'm writing. I have right next to my desk an altar with pictures of my grandparents and other beloved people who have passed away. And so when I'm writing, I'm always turning and like looking at my grandparents, looking at their faces. So I think the visual for me does inspire me, and it is an important part of my writing and just my existence.
Um, Before I let you go, could I ask each of you just to share with our audience your most recent books? And I would add that these are all available at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and where books are found. So, Marjorie, your latest?
And one is very appropriate for our conversation. It's called The Guardian of Memory, Aldo Izzo and the Jewish Cemetery of the Lido, which is about an older gentleman taking care of this ancient cemetery of the 14th century. And I just received this almost like also their prose poem is called Notes from the Sea, a collection, Ruth was talking about the ocean, a collection of poems about the ocean.
Right. And Ruth?
That's beautiful. And the Guardian of Memory has photographs in
Yeah,
the book too, so the visual is
yeah.
there. It's a very beautiful, very, very powerful book. So my latest is the one I've been mentioning, Across So Many Seas. This is the newest book, and for those of you that read Spanish, it is in Spanish, A Través de los Mares. So it's in both languages, which I'm really happy about. And this book just came out now in February, so it's the latest book that I have.
As always, thanks to you both. We look forward to having you back on here again, to coming to see us here at the center, and more conversations. Again, you bring so much to the work, so we greatly appreciate your sharing their conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thanks to all the audience that's been with us today too. Thank you so much.
I want to thank our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, for all of her help behind the scenes. Today's program is part of our ongoing series of virtual and live programs. Join us Sunday, May 5th, either in person here at the Yiddish Book Center or virtually via live stream, of the 2024 Melinda Rosenblatt Lecture, Warsaw Testament with Professor Samuel Kassow. You can register for that program and check out all of our calendar of events to see what's coming up, both in person and virtually. And I will tell you that we've got a lot here at the center, including visit our new core exhibition, Yiddish Global Culture. Yidstock is coming up in July. So check out yiddishbookcenter.org/events to learn about all of that and to learn how you can come and visit. So I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all of our members whose work, whose support, helps all of our ongoing work. To learn more about how you can become a member or provide more support to us, please visit yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Until next time, thanks for joining us here this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you back here again, either in person or at our next virtual program. Take care.